today that is very familiar to us, but also one that shows how very different life is for us as it was back in the time of the New Testament. For us, when we come to church, we walk in the back door, grab a bulletin, and sit down. We don't have any kind of sacrifices to make as far as animals go. We know that Hebrews talks about living our lives as a living sacrifice, but we don't buy doves or birds or anything like that on the way in. We'll be in Matthew 21, by the way, Matthew 21 starting in verse 12. And in this passage, Jesus gets upset. And when I was a kid, the image that I have in my mind of how this scene went is different, I think, than how I picture it as an adult. As a kid, I imagined Jesus kind of like, some kind of a pro wrestler or something, just flipping over tables and running everybody out of the building. But as an adult, when we get a little bit of a different idea of what the temple looked like, our imagination of this passage, I hope, will be a little bit different than that. So Matthew 21, starting in verse 12, Jesus went into the temple, and throughout all those who were buying and selling, he overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves.'" So he comes in and he kicks out everybody who is buying and selling, and he overturns the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. That's a very different imagination of what a worship service would look like, isn't it? We don't have any money changers in our worship services. We don't have any doves. We don't have any tables, chairs that people are sitting behind transacting all of this business. But they did. As we mentioned this morning, sometimes the men and the women would worship separately, and the way that they made that work there at the temple is you have to imagine kind of concentric circles, or kind of a most holy place in the middle, and then kind of a court around that where some people could come, and then a court around that where you could have some more people, and then a court around that where you could have some more people. Not everybody was allowed to enter all the way into the holiest place. We don't believe that kind of thing anymore. We would welcome anyone to come to our worship services. We would welcome anyone who wanted to give praise to God. And I hope people could sit pretty much wherever they wanted, stand wherever they wanted, however that might be. But back then they were separated. If you were Jewish by birth, you could go to a certain distance away. Or if you were male or female, you had different distances. If you had converted to Judaism later, things like that. But the way that one of the ways that they worshipped back then was through this sacrifice, animal sacrifice, in order to bring about the forgiveness of their sins. We know that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus has accomplished all of that sacrifice for us. But back then, they believed that in order to receive this forgiveness, they had to sacrifice an animal. So when it came time for this festival, Passover, before Jesus was crucified, thousands of people came to Jerusalem trying to worship. Some of the commentators said 300,000 to 400,000 people coming in to worship. And there's not too many events where 300,000 or 400,000 people come to this area. I can only think of one. Can anybody think of anything besides the races in Bristol that might have that many people? And just like those kind of events, prices of everything go way up because people can't pack everything that they need. And you couldn't pack all of the animals that you would need for these sacrifices and trek all the way across the countryside to get there. And so, because of that, you would have people who were there to sell animals for sacrifice. It sounds like they're doing a good thing, trying to help out people who can't bring those sacrifices, but unfortunately, they weren't really doing a good thing. They would raise all the prices and take advantage of people. And the priests at the time, the Pharisees, made sure that people who brought their own sacrifices were told that they weren't really good enough. They weren't perfect. But this guy over here selling the doves, those are all pre-approved. You can buy those and sacrifice just fine. And so if you really wanted to worship, you would come in and you would try to buy one of those doves to make your sacrifice, or whatever other animals they might have had. And you wait in line and you wait, and you eventually can buy this dove, but then you're told, oh, by the way, your money's not good here. You'll need to get it changed over there from your currency to the temple currency. So you go over there. And they would raise up the price of the conversion rate and take advantage of people. So in order to worship, you might come with a certain amount of money and you buy this currency and you trade that currency for these doves, and you can't get the kind of sacrifice that you wanted. Or you end up having to spend all of your money on that sacrifice because you truly believe that that's the way to bring about forgiveness, because you're following the Old Testament. But Jesus, he's got a better way. He's got a different way, and we'll find that out throughout the rest of the gospel. But by this point, the people didn't know that. The people were following the only system that they knew, and they were being taken advantage of every year when they'd come to Jerusalem to try to worship. This is one of the few stories in the Gospels that all four Gospel writers record for us. Each one slightly different, but each one has it for us. And I think what the Gospel writers want us to understand in this passage is that Jesus does not like it when people are taken advantage of. When his house, his Father's house, becomes not a place of worship, not a place of prayer, but a place where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's not his idea of worship. It should not be a place where there is all of this business dealing. It's a place of worship. When I was growing up, we had different kind of rules. And I guess each of your families had different kinds of rules, but my family especially, we had certain rules when it came to church. And you'll see Nathan break most of them, but hopefully we can catch him in time to stop him. But we had a rule: no running in the church. Anybody else have that rule when you were a kid? Okay. The reason for that rule, we were told, is because my mom didn't want us to run over Miss Mary. Miss Mary was one of her old Sunday school teacher who had recently stopped teaching. So she was never my Sunday school teacher, but she was the longtime Sunday school teacher, and she walked with a cane. And we were told we shouldn't run because if we're coming around a corner, we could run into somebody. And we had another rule that when it came time to clean the church, if you ever found any money, that money has to go in the offering plate. I think that makes sense as a rule. We had another rule. When I sat with my grandmother every Sunday, we could have gum, but only after communion. We couldn't have gum at the beginning of the service. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense or not for a kid who didn't take communion. But in this culture, this worship looked very different. Oh, I skipped probably the most important rule. One of the rules that we had was based on this passage. One of the rules that we had as a church, it was unwritten, of course, but you couldn't sell Girl Scout cookies at church. And the reason for it was this passage. So whenever, and I wasn't a Girl Scout, but we sold candy bars, as kids, but you couldn't sell your candy bars or your Girl Scout cookies at church. But for some reason, they were perfectly fine with selling them just outside the front door. So they wanted to use this verse as a proof for why you shouldn't sell Girl Scout cookies at church. And I think there's a whole lot more to this passage than that. I don't want to make a determination about whether Girl Scout cookies should be sold. I don't think that's nearly as important as other stuff here. But that's what we were taught as kids. And that was what we were taught was the most important part about this passage. And there's so much more to this passage than that. Jesus talks about how his house, his Father's house, has become a house of, it doesn't say den of robbers here, but that's in other versions of it. But it's a place of buying and selling. It's a place that is not being used for worship and for prayer. But that should be the primary purpose of coming to worship. I want to flip over to John chapter 2, verse 13. That's one of the other places this story is told. There are a lot of people who think that this is a different story, that Jesus actually cleared out the temple twice, one at the beginning of his ministry and one at the end. I think you can go either way with that. It doesn't impact, I don't think, the meaning of the story very much. So whether he did it once or twice doesn't really matter too much to me as far as that goes. But in chapter 2 of John, starting in verse 13, it gives us a little more context to the story. It makes it make a little bit more sense. He says the Jewish Passover was near, and that's the big yearly festival that I mentioned. And so Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling oxen and sheep and doves, and he also found money changers sitting there. It's a little bit more detailed, a little more of the animals that were being sold at the time. And you can imagine, if you thought a little table of someone with doves would be a little disruptive, imagine trying to sell oxen there at the temple and sheep, and what that would smell like, what that would be like wandering through, how loud it would be, how difficult that would be for people who were trying to worship. After making a whip of cords, he drove everyone out of the temple with their sheep and their oxen, and he poured out the money changers' coins and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling doves, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And his disciples remembered what is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And the Jews replied, "What sign will you show us for doing these things?" They want to know what kind of authority he has to disrupt their buying and selling. And he's going to tell them, but I think we should be reminded of the passage from Sunday school today, where the young woman who is a fortune teller comes to Christ and no longer tells these demonic fortunes, and her owner gets upset when he's hit in the pocketbook, when his livelihood is impacted, or the riots when the silversmiths started to go out of business because people came to Christ instead of worshiping all of those idols. In this passage, Jesus is disrupting the economic system that they had. It wasn't just the money changers making money. It wasn't just the people who were selling the doves who made money. It was the priests, the Pharisees, who were renting out that space to them, who were getting kickbacks, who were allowing all of this to happen. They were the ones who created the religious system that was going on. They were the ones who okayed all of these things. They were the ones ultimately taking advantage of people. And Jesus didn't like that. Later on, he's going to tell them, wow, I'm going to butcher another quote, aren't I? He's going to talk about devouring widows' houses and what their kind of mindset would do to people. And he's going to flip that whole mindset, that's the whole situation upside down, because suddenly none of these animals are needed. Suddenly people can worship God without those sacrifices because Jesus was the sacrifice. Pretty soon people could worship anywhere, not just on a certain mountain, but anywhere. And he's going to change all of those things. But here we have one of the first opportunities where we see what Jesus is doing to flip around that system. And we'll see later how upset that they get. This is one of the first events that leads up directly to his death. Because Passover and Easter are not terribly far apart. These events lead one to another. So what's the point of this passage? I already said it's not about Girl Scout cookies. It's not about candy bars. It's about putting things in the way of other people trying to worship. It is systemic things that stop people from coming to God. And that's where the problem lies here in this passage. It's the greed of the Pharisees. It's the greed and the selfishness of these people who were selling things. But more importantly than that, it's all the innocent people who were trying to worship who can't worship freely because of all that. It's one person standing in the way of somebody else's faith. Jesus would say to them in one of his other teachings that if you cause a young person to stumble, you might as well have tied a millstone around your neck and be cast into the sea. He cared about other people's spiritual conditions. He cared about people who were trying to follow after him. It's hard enough to follow after God without other people standing in the way. But that's exactly what's happening here, is people standing in the way of other people who were trying to worship. And they're trying to do their best to do God's will, and there's other people who are in the way. When I was trying to figure out how we can apply this passage, it's kind of difficult, I think, because our systems are totally different. But I started trying to think back of times where people stood in the way of someone who was trying to worship God. I thought about one of my first interviews as a pastor. I forget even what church it was, but they turned me down, which I expected. First time, shooting out resumes and things, and I asked what can I do differently? What can I do better? How can I be a better candidate for future places? And they said, well, you ought to be a youth minister first for a few years before you become a minister. And it kind of hit me because they're saying basically to people, you ought to do for a few years something God has not called you for before we'll allow you to do something that God has called you to do. And that was the first story that came to my mind when it came to this passage, because there were people who were standing in the way of me trying to do what God has called me to do. God has not called me to be a youth minister. If you guys haven't noticed, definitely that's not my gift. Doesn't matter what age the kids are. I'm not great at that. And so I would encourage people, don't tell somebody to do something that is not God's will just to be able to do something that is. One of the churches that I had applied at, when you apply at a church, you kind of talk to them and learn a lot about them and things like that. And one of their systems that they had was for someone who wanted to serve at the church. If you wanted to do like a Sunday school teacher or lead in worship or things like that, one of their requirements was you had to be on the list for cleaning the church. Now, not everybody is gifted in cleaning a church, right? But that was what they required. Put an extra level of requirement into what people had to do in order to serve God, in order to use their gifts. And it got in the way, and people who were not called to do that ministry ended up not doing their other ministry too. And I think that was a detriment to the situation there. Because when God has called us to something, we ought to be doing that thing. We shouldn't have to do 17 other things to get there. When missionaries were first going from England and from America into Africa, one of the things that they would do, they would bring the gospel. But they also tried to westernize the people, tried to make them democratic, tried to make them capitalist, tried to make them wear Western clothing and change to Western culture. And it hurt the ministry there because the gospel works in every culture. You don't have to change somebody in order to make them, you don't have to change somebody into a British person in order to become a Christian. It doesn't work that way. You don't have to convert to Judaism first to become a Christian. When someone is trying to follow after God, we just need to let them. We don't need to get in their way. We don't need to be like the Pharisees here who were forcing people to do other things in order to worship God. The Pharisees were they were notorious for that. They had a saying, you may have heard this before. Have you ever heard the term fence around the Torah? Okay, so the Torah is the Old Testament law. And in order to follow that Old Testament law, the way the Pharisees' mindset is, well, what we need to do is we really need to make sure that people follow this law. So if the law says, for example, the speed limit is 60 miles an hour, they would say, well, we ought not to drive more than 45 so that we don't accidentally go over 60. Have you run into people like that before? And you look at any of the Old Testament rules and see how they could be expanded beyond that to make it even more strict. And I think as parents, we sometimes have to do that. If the rule is don't play in the street, the rule really is don't play near the street. Because we don't want our children to be hurt. But as adults, when we've got rules, we don't have to have rules on top of rules on top of rules. Pharisees ended up coming up with somewhere around 600 different laws that people had to follow in order to follow after God. And when Jesus came around, he summarized all of those laws into two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That was all the laws that they needed. But the Pharisees were stacking laws on top of each other. They were focusing, he says, on little things like mint and cumin. How do you give a tithe of what's in your garden? That was the big question. Is how do we do that? When they were leaving out things like justice and mercy, it says the big things. They were forgetting about the important stuff because they were focusing on the little things. So this passage goes a little bit bigger than what we think. The passage, I think, is more important than at least what I first thought. Trying to figure out what are these things that we do that stop other people from becoming a Christian, stop other people from following after God. I can't really answer that question for everyone. Some of the things that I thought might fit in here is things like discipleship. How does the church function in order to bring people from wherever they are into being a follower of Christ who is using their gifts? How do we exactly put our time into other people in order to lift them up and to encourage them and to strengthen them and to help them to become the best Christian that they can be? Or what are the things that we do that exclude people from worship, that exclude people from service? What do we do that belittles people, that pushes them down, that prevents them from doing what God has called them to do? Those are the kind of things that we need to stop doing. that we need to make sure that we're not doing. As Christians and as church leaders, we need to protect people who are being hurt by other Christians. We need to be open to anyone coming in who wants to follow after God. And I think we need to be open to change, open to God speaking to us, understanding that we're not perfect. Jesus, when he walked into this temple to flip over the tables of the money changers and those selling doves, this system that was in place was put in place by people who had memorized the Old Testament, people who had been teaching all of God's writing for their whole lives, from the time that they were young until however old they were. That was what their job was. We mentioned in Sunday school a couple of weeks ago, I think, that rabbis, teachers at the time, often had other jobs. Just like Paul was a tent maker. They would have some kind of other job, but the ones who served in the temple, they had no other job. That was the only thing that they did, is study Scripture. At least was what they were supposed to do, was study Scripture and pray and worship and do sacrifices for people. They should have been the people who were closest to God. And they were the ones who created that system. And I think if they had been open to God correcting them, they never would have gotten themselves into that kind of system that hurt so many people. Hundreds of thousands of people every year being taken advantage of by that group of people. But they weren't open to God changing their mind, God changing their attitude. And when Jesus comes in, they're still not open to him. Jesus comes in and shows them, and in this case he shows them physically, but then he shows them with Scripture what they're doing wrong. And their response to Jesus about a week later is going to be to kill him. And to try to kill him, to try to rope the Romans into killing him. Whatever they can do, they're going to try to end his ministry because of him. And all he's doing is correcting them. All he's doing is saying, hey, this Messiah that you guys have been waiting on, I'm here. This Old Testament that you've been following, you've added so much to it. But what you really need to focus on is God. Instead of all this rigmarole, all these things going on, the thing that you need to focus on is prayer. This week, last year, I started to pray a lot because we had first started to get news reports of this new virus that had gone around in China and Italy at the time. And I started to pray about what might be happening around us, how it's going to impact us, how it's going to impact the churches, things like that. And I realized that, we're a year past that. And I haven't been praying as much about it. When things don't feel as desperate, we don't pray as much. When we don't feel so scared, we don't pray as fervently. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation where you were terrified and all you could think to do was pray. And the fervent prayer of that moment. But Jesus says that his house, God's house, should be a house of prayer. It's a house where anyone can pray about anything. It's a place where people should be encouraged to talk to God, the God who created them. They should be able to communicate with him. They shouldn't be prevented from following him, from seeking after him. And I think one of the biggest things that prevents each of us from following after God is not some kind of system. It's not money changers. It's not doves and things like that. It's ourselves. It's forgetting what's important. If prayer was important a year ago, it's still important today. If prayer was important during that desperate time, it's still important today. The same God who answered our prayers back then is the one answering them today. And so I would encourage each of you guys this week to think about what is standing in the way of your prayer life. What is in the way of you personally following after God? Or in what ways are you preventing someone else from worshiping and following after God? This passage, I think I mentioned that it was in all four Gospels. It's in Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19, and John 2, because it's important. The kind of stories that are in all four Gospels, I made a list of them. The beginning of Jesus' ministry, the feeding of the 5,000, and then all the other stories are from the last week of his life. Palm Sunday, predicting that Judas would betray him. Peter's denial, the trial before Pilate, the death, burial, and resurrection. And this story of clearing out the temple. Because clearing out our temple and making our temple a house of prayer is important. Because if we are Christians, we believe that the Holy Spirit dwells in us. We are God's temple. We are His workmanship, built with His hands in order to serve Him, in order to spread His gospel through this world. I'm going to close us in prayer. But I would encourage, like I said, encourage each of you to think about prayer life this week and think about the ways that we can focus more